After 4 years of caring for my husband following his accident, I came home early one evening and overheard him on a video call with his old friends, telling them with a laugh that I was too committed to ever go anywhere, so I left. That's the shortest version. But the whole truth is something I've carried for a long time, and I think it matters to say it properly. Because if you've ever quietly disappeared inside a life you built around someone else, I think you'll recognize yourself in this story. My name is Jade, I'm 33 years old, and I live in Hamilton, Ontario. 4 years ago, my husband and I were building something real together. He worked in commercial construction, long hours but good pay, always coming home with energy to spare. I was an occupational therapist at a rehabilitation clinic on the west end of the city, a job I'd spent years in school for and genuinely loved. We had a condo we were slowly making into a home, plans to travel once we'd saved enough, the kind of quiet, steady life that doesn't photograph well, but feels like everything when you're inside it. Then black ice on the 403 took it all apart in about 3 seconds. It was a Friday evening in February. He was driving home from a job site when his truck lost traction. The vehicle hit the center median, spun across 2 lanes, and came to rest against the guardrail. He was airlifted to Hamilton Health Sciences. By the time I arrived, still in my work clothes, the attending surgeon was explaining that he had sustained a serious injury to his lower spine. Incomplete, they called it, which the doctors said was actually the more hopeful kind. But the immediate reality was that he would have limited mobility in his legs. And whether that was permanent was something no one could promise either way. I sat beside his hospital bed for the rest of that night and told him we would figure it out together. I meant every word of it. He spent 6 weeks in acute care, then moved to the rehabilitation unit. I came every single day. I learned the terminology, attended every meeting with the physiatrist, took notes in a notebook I kept in my bag. When the discharge planning team began talking about what life at home would look like, I was the one with the answers. I knew his medication schedule, his mobility equipment, his dietary restrictions, the exercises his physiotherapist had already started him on. What I hadn't fully understood yet was what all of that was going to cost me. 2 weeks before he came home, I put in my notice at the clinic. My supervisor was kind. She offered a leave of absence rather than a resignation, said the position would still be there. But I was certain, the way you can only be certain when you haven't yet lived what's coming, that I could manage his care and eventually return to work once he was more stable. It seemed like the only reasonable thing to do. I told myself it was temporary. What actually happened was that 4 years went by. Our mornings began before 6. He needed help transferring from the bed to the wheelchair, help dressing, help with personal hygiene. Breakfast had to follow the anti-inflammatory diet his nutritionist had recommended, which meant reading labels and cooking from scratch more often than not. His medications were timed. The pill organizer I filled every Sunday, the prescriptions I picked up from Shoppers Drug Mart on a rotating schedule, the supplements his naturopath had suggested, and that needed to be taken separately from his other medications so they didn't interfere. By 8 in the morning, I had already done 2 hours of work. Then came the calls. Ontario Health at Home covered a certain number of PSW hours each week, but it was never quite enough, and the approved hours were regularly reviewed and adjusted, which meant I spent hours on hold with the care coordinator's office, submitting documentation, requesting reassessments, filing appeals when the hours were reduced. The disability paperwork from his former employer's insurance policy came in dense envelopes I learned to parse. His WSIB claim was complicated because the accident had happened while he was commuting, close enough to the job site to be ambiguous, and that required its own correspondence with an adjuster and occasional calls with a benefits advisor. I handled all of it. On top of that, physiotherapy twice a week at the clinic, which meant 2 drives each way and an hour in the waiting room. The home exercises his physiotherapist had prescribed, which I reminded him about and often had to guide him through. Grocery runs to no frills on the days he didn't want to come along, which was most days. Cleaning, laundry, meal prep, bills, building maintenance requests, his adaptive equipment assessments. Once, an occupational therapist came to the apartment to evaluate his setup, doing, in our kitchen, exactly the kind of work I had once done for patients at my own clinic. I noticed the symmetry without letting myself think about it too long. I never took a day off. Even on mornings when the pain in my lower back was sharp enough to make me grip the bathroom counter before I could stand upright. Months of assisting with transfers had compressed something in my lumbar spine that hadn't healed properly. I didn't stop. I told myself it would ease once I had more rest. That day kept not arriving. The loneliness, I think, was the thing I was least prepared for. In the early months, my friends reached out often. They brought food, offered to sit with him so I could get out for a few hours. But caregiving doesn't follow a schedule that fits neatly into other people's lives, and slowly the visits became phone calls. And the phone calls became less frequent, and eventually I stopped hearing from most of them regularly at all. I understood. I didn't blame them. But I'd be lying if I said I didn't feel it. And then there was the change in him. In those first months home, he thanked me for things. He said he didn't know what he would do without me. He talked about the future in a way that included both of us. I held on to that version of him as the months stretched on and the gratitude started to fade. By the second year, thank you had mostly disappeared. He would ask for something and get irritated if I didn't get to it right away. If dinner wasn't what he felt like, he said so without much softening in his voice. If I reminded him about a prescribed exercise, he'd snap that he already knew, even though he'd skip it if I didn't follow up. I kept finding reasons to explain it to myself. He was in chronic pain. He had lost his independence, his career, the physical identity he'd spent his whole working life building. The frustration was understandable. The man I married was still in there. I just had to keep being patient. I told myself that a lot, just be patient. The evening that changed everything came near the end of October. He'd had physiotherapy that morning, which I'd driven him to, and he'd spent the afternoon in the living room feeling tired. Around 4 o'clock I realized I'd forgotten a prescription that needed to be refilled, and we were also nearly out of a few things. Eggs, the specific yogurt his nutritionist recommended, the almond milk he decided he preferred. I told him I was making a quick run and would be back in 40 minutes. The pharmacy was less busy than I expected. I was home in 32. I came in quietly through the front door, because I thought he might have dozed off. I set the bags down in the entryway and was taking off my coat when I heard his voice coming from the living room. He was on a video call with a group of his old friends from construction. I recognized the cadence of those conversations, the back and forth that came easily with people who had worked together for years. I stopped in the hallway and listened for a second, the way you do when you're not sure whether you're about to walk in on something. Then I heard what he said. Jade's basically running the whole show here. He sounded easy and relaxed, warm in a way I hadn't heard directed at me in a long time. She does everything. Honestly, she's like a full-time caregiver at this point. There was laughter from the other end of the call. He laughed too. She's not going anywhere though. She's too, you know how she is, too committed. It's her whole thing. More laughter. Nah, I don't even worry about it. I stood very still in the hallway. He sounded comfortable, unbothered, the way someone sounds when they are describing something they have simply made their peace with. The way you might mention that the downstairs neighbor parks a bit crooked, a manageable fact of life that requires no further attention. I wasn't a person to him in that moment. I was a fixture. Something stationary and reliable that he didn't have to think about, the same way you don't think about the couch staying in the living room. I didn't walk in. I didn't say anything. I carried the grocery bags to the kitchen, put everything away, and sat down at the table in the dimming afternoon light and stayed there for a while. That night, after I'd helped him with his evening routine and after he'd gone to sleep, I sat at the kitchen table again with a notebook. I had read somewhere that writing things down could help clarify your thinking. I started writing. I made a list of everything I had done that week. Not a summary, an actual accounting of every task, every call, every drive, every meal, every exercise session I'd prompted, every form I'd filed, every time I'd woken in the night to help him reposition. By the time I stopped writing, I had filled 3.5 pages. I stared at those pages for a long time. Then I opened my laptop and looked up the hourly rate for a personal support worker through a private home care agency in Ontario. The rates I found ranged from $32 to $40 an hour, depending on the level of care. If someone were paid to cover the hours I was putting in, the personal care, the medication management, the appointment accompaniment, the physiotherapy support, the coordination work, the monthly cost would fall somewhere between $5,000 and $6,000 Canadian. Conservative estimate. I had been doing that work for 4 years, without a salary, without benefits, without sick days or holidays, or the basic legal protections that come with formal employment. I had walked away from a career that had taken years of education and clinical placement to build. I had given up my income, my professional identity, the daily work that had made me feel capable and purposeful in the world. And in return, I had become something my husband described to his friends, with the same casual certainty he might use to talk about the weather. I didn't feel fury right away. It came slowly, the way feeling comes back to something that's been numb. First came clarity. Then, underneath it, something that had been accumulating for a very long time. I opened my email and typed a message to the director of my former clinic. I said I had been thinking about returning to practice, and asked whether there was anything available. I wasn't expecting a quick response. I just needed to send something. She replied the next morning, before I'd started breakfast. She said she was glad to hear from me, that their outpatient program had recently expanded, and that she'd love to talk. Could I come in that week? I read the message twice, then I said yes, Thursday afternoon. I didn't tell my husband. I told myself I wasn't ready to explain what I was doing before I knew what I was walking toward. But honestly, I also didn't have the energy to manage his reaction before I had studied things in my own mind. That week, while he watched television in the afternoons, I researched home care options. The Ontario Health at Home Coordinator could reassess his needs and increase his funded hours. I knew the process well enough to know it was worth requesting. For the gap a private PSW agency could fill in, I looked at several agencies, compared their services, read their screening requirements, checked their reviews. Personal care, medication reminders, meal preparation, mobility support, transportation to medical appointments. Everything, in other words, that I had been doing. I started making notes. I built a document, medications and dosages, physiotherapy schedule, physician's contact information, pharmacy details, his insurance policy number, his Ontario Health at Home Care Coordinator. I thought about the binder I would put together before I left, organized, tabbed, nothing ambiguous. I had built one like it the week he came home from the hospital. 2 days before I planned to leave, I heard it again. I was in the bedroom folding laundry when his voice carried through the half-open door. He was on the phone with his brother. I heard him say, with the same easy certainty as before, "She won't go anywhere. That's just not who she is." I stopped folding. I looked at the shirt in my hands for a moment, then set it down carefully on the bed. I had wondered, in the days since the video call, whether I'd taken something out of context, whether one overheard moment had grown into something larger than it actually was. Hearing it again, the exact same sentiment, the exact same untroubled confidence, said to a different person on a different day, answered that question cleanly. He genuinely believed it. He had said it twice without hesitation. It was not a slip. It was how he understood our marriage. I finished folding the laundry, put it away, and that evening I went to the interview. Walking into the clinic felt like a room I had convinced myself I'd permanently left. The smell of it, the sounds from the reception area, the light coming through the windows in the late afternoon, all of it exactly as I remembered. My former clinic director and I talked for over an hour. She asked about my work over the past 4 years. I told her what I had maintained, what I had learned, what I had been doing informally that had kept my clinical thinking sharp. She said something I've thought about many times since. That time didn't take you away from your profession. It gave you a depth of understanding about what patients actually live through that you can't get any other way. Before I left, she offered me a part-time position with the possibility of moving to full-time after 3 months. I said yes before she finished the sentence. On the way home, I stopped to look at a 1-bedroom apartment I'd found listed online. A 15-minute walk from the clinic, on a street with old maples still holding their last leaves. The super showed me through. It was small and clean, with good light and a kitchen that smelled like fresh paint. It was exactly what I needed. I paid the deposit before I left the building. The next morning, I spent building the binder. I organized it the way I would have organized a patient file at work, tabbed sections, clear headers, nothing that required interpretation, medical contacts with direct numbers, medication schedule with dosages and timing, and a note about what each medication was prescribed for and when refills were due. Physiotherapy exercise sheets with the guidance his therapist had provided. A 3-month appointment calendar. His insurance policy details and the adjuster's contact number. Ontario Health at Home Coordinator information with the reference number for the reassessment I had already requested. Pharmacy details. Emergency contacts. A note about the building's wheelchair-accessible entrance and the visitor parking arrangement. I printed everything, put it in a 3-ring binder, and labeled the spine. Then I called the PSW agency I had chosen and confirmed the start time. His funded hours through Ontario Health at Home were being increased. The private agency would cover the remaining gap. Everything was in place. His care would not lapse. I had made sure of it. That evening was entirely ordinary. I made dinner, helped him through his evening routine, said goodnight. He didn't notice anything different. He had not been watching closely enough, for long enough, to notice. The morning I left, I was awake before my alarm. I made coffee and stood at the kitchen window watching the street below. It was a gray November morning, the soft kind, not the harsh kind, the light coming in low and even. I had lived in this apartment for 6 years. I knew every corner of it. Standing in that kitchen felt strange, not sad exactly, but weighted in a way I understood I had to move through rather than around. I helped my husband with his morning routine as I always did. I made his breakfast. When he was settled with his coffee and the television, I carried the binder to the kitchen table and set it in front of him. He looked at it, then at me. "What's this?" "It has everything you'll need," I said. "Your medication schedule, your physiotherapy plan, your medical contacts, your insurance information, your appointment calendar, and instructions for your daily care. I've also included your Ontario Health at Home coordinator's details. Your hours have been increased, and the new assessment is already filed. A PSW from the agency will be here at 9. He was very still. He looked at the binder, then back at me, and I could see the moment the situation became real to him. "I've been offered my position back at the clinic," I said. "I've also rented an apartment nearby, and I'll be moving my things today." "You're leaving," he said. It wasn't really a question. "Yes." He asked me why. I had thought about how I would answer that, and I had decided to say it plainly, without performance. "I've spent 4 years giving everything I had to your care," I said. "I did it because I loved you, and because I believed that love meant showing up even when it was hard. What I didn't understand was that somewhere along the way, you stopped seeing me as someone who was choosing to be here, and started treating me like someone who simply had no other option." Something shifted in his face, the look of a person beginning to understand that they have made an irreversible error. "A wife is a partner," I said. "She isn't someone you keep because she feels too responsible to go anywhere. I needed you to know the difference. I don't think you've been able to see it, at least not until now." The buzzer sounded. The PSW from the agency was downstairs right on time. I went to the intercom and let her in. When she came to the door, I introduced everyone, walked her through the binder, pointed out the key sections of his routine. She was professional and warm, asked the right questions, and I answered everything clearly. Then I picked up my bag. I had packed lightly, just what I needed for the first week, and walked to the door. I didn't look back, not to make a point. I had made every decision over the preceding weeks carefully and deliberately, and everything that needed to be said had been said, and there was nothing left to do but go. The first week in my new apartment was quieter than anything I had known in 4 years. I woke when I wanted to. I made my own coffee slowly, without checking the time. I drove to the clinic and relearned what it felt like to be around colleagues who asked how I was doing and actually waited for the answer. I called my closest friend, the one whose texts I'd been answering with one-word replies for 2 years, and we talked for nearly 2 hours. It felt like drinking water after a very long time without it. My husband called several times that week. I answered once. I told him I hoped the transition was going smoothly with the new care team, that the binder had everything anyone would need, and that I genuinely wished him well. He asked if we could talk more. I told him this was where I needed to leave things for now, and I said it without anger, because I had none left. 6 months later, we met once more. A rainy Saturday afternoon, a coffee shop on James Street. He looked like someone who had spent half a year rethinking something he had been certain of. He told me he was sorry. He said he had confused my devotion for something that belonged to him, that he had stopped understanding the difference between a choice and an obligation. He said he hadn't seen any of it clearly until I walked out. I told him I accepted his apology, and I meant it. Holding on to bitterness would only keep me anchored to a place I had worked hard to leave. But I also told him that I couldn't return to a marriage where I had slowly stopped existing as a full person. He nodded. He understood. I think he had known the answer before he asked. We said goodbye in the parking lot in the rain. I drove home with the radio on, the wipers going, the streets gray and ordinary and entirely mine. What I know now, looking back, is that love does require sacrifice, sometimes serious, sustained, unglamorous sacrifice. Caring for someone you love through something devastating is one of the most honest things a person can do. But love doesn't require you to disappear. And the moment the person you are caring for stops seeing your presence as a choice and starts counting on it like a given, the moment your kindness becomes their entitlement, something has gone wrong that patience alone won't fix. I chose my husband when he needed me most, and then 4 years later I chose myself. If you were in my position, what would you have done? I'd genuinely like to know. Share your thoughts in the comments below, and if this story meant something to you, please consider sharing it with someone who might need to hear it. Thank you for staying with me until the end.